In 2026, the United States will mark its 250th anniversary. But long before it was a recognized country, it was a radical idea. The proposition that anyone could arrive on these shores, cast off poverty, and claim for themselves life, liberty, and a future of their own making. 1776 is simply a legal starting line. For millennia before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, this immense landmass was already fully inhabited. Small bands of hunter-gatherers had crossed over from Siberia during the last ice age, eventually spreading to fill every ecological niche across the continent. These were complex, highly organized societies. Down in the floodplains of the Mississippi River Valley, the city of Cahokia supported up to 20,000 people. By the 12th century, it had grown larger than many major European capitals, including London. The story of America begins with a violent collision. A vast network of established indigenous nations suddenly found themselves facing an influx of European empires, all seeking total domination of the land. For the early English settlers clinging to the Atlantic coast, survival was the only priority. Colonies like Jamestown nearly starved. They were saved only by shifting to lucrative cash crops like tobacco, shipping tens of thousands of pounds back to England to generate massive profits. Producing that much tobacco required enormous amounts of labor. In August 1619, a ship sailed into Virginia and sold the first documented enslaved Africans into servitude in English North America. This single transaction embedded human bondage directly into the colonial economy, laying the foundation for a brutal institution that would persist for over 200 years. As the 13 colonies grew wealthier, the British Crown took notice, having accumulated enormous debts fighting the French and Indian War. London decided the Americans should pay for their own defense through new taxes. Because the colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, they met these demands with riots and boycotts. By 1776, armed rebellion had broken out, and the delegates in Philadelphia made a radical choice. They drafted a formal document to sever ties with the British Empire, explicitly declaring all men are created equal. When John Hancock and the delegates signed this declaration, they created a nation based on liberty while simultaneously relying on an economy of enslaved labor. The United States was born from the Declaration of Human Liberty, yet it was constructed on an infrastructure of enslavement and territorial displacement. This tension would define the country from its very first breath. This map illustrates the Republic's explosive growth in the 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 pursed the borders to the Rocky Mountains, and victory in the Mexican-American War extended the frontier all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This expansion required the forced removal of indigenous tribes. Under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, populations like the Cherokee and Seminole were marched to designated Indian territories in present-day Oklahoma, with thousands dying from exposure and starvation along the way. In the wake of this conquest came an absolute economic frenzy. The discovery of gold in the Sierra Nevada mountains drew hundreds of thousands of prospectors out west, turning sleepy villages like San Francisco into booming metropolises almost overnight. This relentless push across the continent generated staggering wealth, but every new territory acquired forced the country to answer an increasingly volatile question. Would this expanding empire run on free labor, or would it be driven by the Southern system of plantation slavery? The divide over expanding slavery into these Western states eventually broke the country. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who ran on a mandate to halt that expansion, led the Southern states to secede and form the Confederacy, tearing the Union apart. The resulting Civil War unleashed industrial-scale warfare on American soil, claiming more than 600,000 lives. What began as a fight to preserve the Union evolved into an explicit military campaign to destroy the institution of slavery. To legally cement that victory, Congress passed the 13th Amendment in 1865. This document formally abolished slavery throughout the United States, a legislative triumph won at an unfathomable human cost. But the promise of that amendment was quickly suffocated. After the withdrawal of federal troops, the Southern states moved to construct the Jim Crow laws, replacing slavery with a rigid system of racial segregation and terror. The nation had survived its greatest fracture and eradicated its original sin on paper, but in reality, true liberty and equality remained violently denied to millions of its own citizens. While the South remained segregated, the rest of the country surged forward. Fueled by vast natural resources and millions of new European immigrants, the United States transformed into the world's largest industrial economy. This industrial might ended American isolationism. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States became the primary supplier and fighting force for the Allies, securing the victory that ended the Second World War. The United States emerged from the conflict as a nuclear superpower. For the next several decades, it was locked in a tense ideological Cold War against the Soviet Union, struggling to contain the spread of communism around the globe. Asserting moral superiority on the world stage exposed a bitter hypocrisy. The government was spending billions to project democracy abroad while enforcing segregation at home. This contradiction fueled the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Through decades of relentless activism, everyday citizens forced the government to finally pass sweeping civil and voting rights legislation, bringing the country closer to the radical ideals it declared in 1776. After navigating the social fractures of the 60s and the diplomatic thaws of the 80s, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 left the United States as the world's sole remaining superpower. For a decade, liberal democracy and free market capitalism appeared to have no rival. That confidence was shattered on a clear September morning in 2001. The devastating attacks of 9/11 launched the War on Terror, dragging the nation into 2 decades of invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, the United States is a behemoth of 340 million people. It is a nation shaped by centuries of colonization, brutal internal fractures, and astonishing expansion. The American story is not a straight line of righteous progress. It is a messy, violent, and ongoing project. The struggle by every new generation to force reality to match the promise of liberty for all.